This question I'm going to direct to Dr. Philpott and Dr. Harvey, and it's in the general area of this idea of fast-track research. And as you know, many organizations involved with rare disorders over the last decade have become very interested in this idea of fast-tracking, somehow bringing discoveries quicker to the clinical applied area so that individuals with these conditions can be helped. Now, the person that submitted this question wanted it related to non-life-threatening disorders. And the question is, should fast-track research be considered in lieu of conducting a properly vetted preclinical trial, a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, for example? Discuss the pros and the cons of fast-tracking in non-life-threatening disorders.
So I think it's an incredibly complex question, first of all, and it's not black and white. It's a huge gray zone. And I think something that everyone struggles with is, when do you take something preclinically and feel confident enough to move it into the clinic? It's difficult enough for disorders that have high prevalence, such as Alzheimer's or schizophrenia, but it's even more difficult for something like Angelman syndrome or Rett syndrome or Fragile X, where there's a very limited patient population. And I think there's certainly a place for fast tracking. And how do you make that decision? I would say, for the most part, you would want to carefully vet as much as possible through preclinical studies, performed in a very rigorous manner before you were to go to a clinical trial. And that's because it's a very precious patient population, precious in many ways, but it's also a very limited patient population. And if a not well thought out research trial has begun, and it fails, then those patients are then excluded often from future research trials. At the same time, there is also clearly an opportunity to do fast track trials. Obviously, as I guess the person who posed the question mentioned, if it's a life-threatening disorder, then that's a clear example where you'd want to do some fast track studies and you're more willing to take a risk. In the case that it's not, I'd say you'd need two things to fast track it. You'd need particularly compelling rationale and have an idea that there's a high degree of safety with the study. And of course, it's easy to say whether something has a particularly compelling rationale and whether there's a high degree of safety. But of course, those are kind of loaded questions in and of themselves. But if you think a study has particularly compelling rationale and it's likely to be safe, then I think that's an opportunity where you might want to fast track. But otherwise, from my perspective, I think, especially with this very limited patient population, rare disorders, you want to carefully vet it as much as possible.
Where to start? So a couple hats here. So from the industry perspective, so from the pharmaceutical industry perspective, I have a real hard time viewing the drug approval process as a fast track. And with all due respect to my colleagues on the panel here, it's really should we put this drug on the very, very slow track, or should we put it on the just slow track? The fast track, the FDA did put in a process a few years ago where this has been on, the drug approval process has been evolving over the years, and there is a track now within the FDA approval process that attempts to speed up the FDA approval process. And that basically gives organizations like Dart Neuroscience, if they're dealing with something that qualifies as the fast track, to get more rapid turnaround and more rapid feedback from the FDA. Generally, it doesn't reduce the level of detail or the type of experimental work that needs to be documented and put in place before we can get a compound through through the preclinical phase and into the clinic and into phase 1 and on through the drug discovery process. So it's not changing the work that needs to be done for the sort of de novo drug design work that the Dart Neuroscience Organization that I'm affiliated with is involved in. But having said that, what we're dealing with in a lot of cases are situations right now within the rare disease area, both Angelman syndrome and many other associated neurological and neurogenetic disorders, where we're looking at repurposing existing drugs. And in those cases, there is a lot of information already known. And so you can, take that information and start from there and move things a little bit quicker through the process. But we do need to be very, very careful about it, because if you get into a situation where you move something through a little too fast and you make a mistake, the investigations in that area are going to just stop completely because of the rush. And this has occurred in other areas as well, where things have been moved into the clinic, and patients have been hurt, and then things are really slowed down to a crawl or worse. So maybe you can respond to.
Yeah, I just want to make a couple points of clarification here, and that is, I think what this question is really addressing is something that in FDA parlance is sort of known as the expanded access program. And so if you want to Google that, that's sort of the lingo to be able to Google, because what that does, the expanded access program is intended to take investigational compounds that have some promise at the end of some preliminary preclinical testing and allow the use in patients who don't clearly fit into investigational protocols of that agent. So for example, if you have some chemotherapeutic agent or something like that for a pediatric cancer that has shown some benefit at the end of phase 2 testing or something like that, and you have someone who doesn't fit into any of the later phase research protocols because they perhaps they don't meet the entry criteria. They've had too much chemotherapy beforehand, their disease is too advanced, et cetera, et cetera. The expanded access program is tailor-made to be able to allow those people to sort of enroll in these expanded access, or treatment IND is another sort of word for it in that sense. There is a fast track process, as my esteemed colleague alluded to, within the agency that has to do with the speed of review. But that's really sort of not what most parents are sort of concerned about. And there's absolutely a great deal of concern on the part of the agency that things that we would decide to put into children have at least had some proof of concept, so that we know that we're not going to do them great harm. And beyond that, that there's at least some potential for benefit to justify the risks of exposing them to these substances. And so there is not within the sort of FDA framework a whole lot of room for really, there has not traditionally been a whole lot of room for really decreasing a lot of that preclinical testing, because otherwise you have no idea what you're putting into people. So if that's...
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make a common sense comment, if that's okay, which is, again, I hate to sort of think, sound like a broken record here, but I keep thinking as a parent in terms of how I would approach this. You're bringing, again, your child in, and you're asking the clinician, is this going to help my child? And by that I mean my child, not whoever it is that was involved in the studies, but I mean my 10-year-old that's sitting here right now, right here. Is this going to help my child, yes or no? So the downside of the whatever we're referring to by fast tracking, miniature development program where you get to market the drug with only 125 people having gotten it. I'm just being slightly farcical, is you can't answer that question. Is my son Sean going to be benefiting from this drug, yes or no? And I, look at my son's phenotype. Tell me how my son's phenotype is just the clinical description of what his issues or problems are, the things he's facing that constitute why we might give him medicine. And tell me whether or not, if the information that was gathered by this investigator through this investigative program is robust enough to be able to inform here and now whether or not if my son should get the medicine. Tell me that. And so that's the downside of this process of rushing to market quickly, is that you just may not have sufficient information to be able to give an informed answer. And then is my son only going to then be on the receiving end of side effects or adverse events instead of benefit? So that's the other part that just is common
Right.
sense.